Hello, and welcome to this week's discussion video. As before, you're supposed to be watching these videos and there will be a discussion participation question at the end. And you need to watch this as part of the course that I would be lecturing on helping you with speech. If you haven't realized it with the classes that we've had in discussion so far, pretty much the subject matter, the textbook, and the terms are going to be done in the class, while these videos are going to be focusing on developing your speech. Of course, we're going to have discussions and stuff to help you with your speech in our classes, but this is more where you can rewatch these videos. And I know it's not the most rewatchable videos. I understand that. So let's get started. First off, last week we talked about the introduction to your speeches. This week we're going to be focusing on the main points. But before we begin, as always, this is your outline. This outline can be found in Files in Canvas, and it can also be found in your syllabus, which is also in Files. So please, again, make sure you find this in Files, and I always print out a copy of these things so I can, do rough drafts on them with pen and so forth, and then type it out, stuff like that. But one of the things you'll notice in these things says transitions. Now we're going to talk about it from the definitions from your book and so forth. But the transition is just like what we reviewed last week, the preview and the main points, where you're doing the road mapping, you're directing your audience to what you want them to do. And so in doing so, you're telling your audience a story, you're telling a narrative. And every time you transition from your intro to your main points, you're taking a turn in that story. And so it's important to remember that. Imagine your transitions, if you've ever been on a flight or seen movies with planes, and the people who are telling the planes to go in this direction with those things. I'm using highlighters because if I brought out lightsabers, it would be way too nerdy. But it is a very important thing to remember. Remember that you're directing your audience, okay, we went this way, we're now going that way. And just remembering that little stuff, that transition, and we're going to do an exercise in class that will help you remember it. Surprisingly, I've seen such high results from this exercise. It's actually, it was very surprising how positive. So we have an exercise to do in class to help you remember transitions. But just like everything else with your speeches, you've already done it before. You've already done transitions before. You know, when I'm doing these videos and I'm in class and this is my background, because the fact of the matter is, this is the most convenient location. I don't do this to show off my degrees, which is right here, or my military headwear, or my nieces who are way older than this picture, by the way, or the books or so forth, or any of that things. Because there may be other places that look better. The reason why I chose is just because convenience on my computers and so forth. But what I was doing right there was directing you and directing your attention. And that's what you're doing with transitions. Like I said, you've done this before. If you ever introduce somebody new to your friend group, hey, this is so-and-so, and this is my friend Timmy, and this is John, and here is Bobby, Ricky, Mike. Anyways, but you understand, it is you're directing your audience, and you've done that before. If you would look over in this direction, same thing. So when you're telling somebody in the transition, okay, I just introduced my subject, let's first talk about my main point one. You obviously will not say that. You'll say something like, okay, I just introduced you to the ideas. Let's go over the first concept. Something simple like that. You'll see in the transition, it says signposts and review. That's exactly what that is. Is like, okay, I just talked about this. Now I'm going to go over and talk about that. It is just a simple thing. When I did forensics, when I was a debater, We actually had to physically move every time we did intro. It was the speaker's triangle. Intro, main point 1, all the way over the other side, main point 2, and then back to the center, main point 3, and then you come forward, conclusion. So that's what a transition is. It's just letting your audience know where you're going next. All right? We'll go more into it in the class. But today's video will be about your main points. There's 3 of them right there. How about that? And the reason why I want to cover it is because, just like I said before, you in other classes, you have done this stuff already. This might be familiar with you with your previous essay writing. And just like an essay, the first sentence or the first lines in your main point are telling your audience what that main point is going to be talking about. Just like when you were writing paragraphs for an essay, the first sentence in the paragraph, not the introductory paragraph, but the supporting paragraphs in that essay, the first sentence was usually the thing that you were telling the audience, this is what the paragraph's about. And then you have the supporting sentences. The main points work like that. You have your main points and then you have your subpoints. But I call them something different. I just, of course, keep the original content of the where the outline is, but I like to call it a grouping. So let me go ahead and just show you. I'm going to go to share screen. 1 second. And we are going into your outline. Again, you can find this PDF or the Word document. The Word document, you can use the Word document or transfer it over to, oops, you can see my kitchen. Let me move the thing. You can actually move the, you can find the outline on the, you use Word and you can fill in the blanks and save it as your file in Word or convert it to whatever document creator you use using the Word file. So just to let you know, you're just filling in the parentheses. And by the way, FYI, remove the parentheses, don't leave them behind. Okay, so your main points. Now the original outline for this, and this is where I changed it, had subpoint A, subpoint B, subpoint C, and so forth. Don't do that. This is your first speech. This is beginning speech and public speaking, and you don't need multiple subpoints. What you need is 2. And the way I explain it is your main points, the first sentences is a summary of your main point, and then you divide it up into 2 main things you want to focus on in that main point, your subpoints. And I like to call them groups. Subpoint A, subpoint B, I like the subgroup A, subpoint B. And this is why. The one thing you want to do is avoid listing off your main point. So you might have a bunch of facts for one of your main points. And you don't want to be that person is, I'm going to talk about this, and then this, and then that, and then that, and then that. You're just in it. You're just giving too many facts out. You're giving up too much content, and you're not really taking your audience and telling a story. If you're using your main point to just list off facts, you're going to lose your audience. So by grouping them into 2 different categories, your subpoints, you will direct your audience. And what I mean by that is this. Let's say your main point 1 is talking about, let's say you're doing a cause and effect type speech, and you're talking about the cause. The first subpoint might be an explanation of the cause. So imagine subpoint A being an explanation. And you kind of have 2 sentences that explain the issue. And your subpoint B would be the examples. You see how that works? Your main point is you're summarizing a cause. You're telling your audience about the cause. And you're in that main point, you're going to first talk about subpoint A, the explanation, and then subpoint B, examples. So I'll give you another example. And then we're going to give another example of this, and then kind of put in the content and how to cram information into this. Your first speech is already laid out for you. You are doing an informative speech about your future planning. You're not talking about your career. You're talking about how you are getting into that career. And your main point is in chronological order. You can't change it. It's past, present, future. So main point 1, past, main point 2, present, main point 3, future. So if you were going to start off your past, and that's, by the way, the one that I talk about being the best place to put your cultural reference requirement, you would summarize saying, my past, I talk about my example from when I was in high school about wanting to be a film director. And I would talk about, I look back into my past and I see how it was a difficult place I grew up in a difficult place, and escaping to the movies was the way to escape my neighborhood. And then subpoint A, talking about the difficulties in the neighborhood. Subpoint B, talking about escaping to the movie theaters. That's it. That's a main point right there. Summary, I'm talking about my past. Subpoint A, that little significant thing. In this case, for me, it was the community reference of the neighborhood I grew up in. And subpoint B, talking about the escapism from that said neighborhood. That's how it works. So let me give you a non-first speech example. If you're doing a speech, an informative speech or a persuasion, and you're doing this. I'm going to talk about a subject that I talk to policymakers and politicians about, and not necessarily, I've never had a student wanting to do a speech. So unfortunately, you can't do this speech, but it's something that is very finite. So it's not too much. Not too many people are jumping at the bit for this one. So anyways, this is the issue is the importance of being restraint with the undocumented community, and the importance of it to the rate, I would say, the to average U.S. citizens. Why we need to be less adversarial, like ICE and so forth, to the undocumented community, because it affects every community in the U.S. And the reason I would do that, so if I had a main point 1, and I would talk about the cause, for example, and I would talk about the effects of the undocumented community being afraid of coming forward, or let's say cause, okay. The undocumented community is afraid to come to law enforcement to report crimes because they're afraid of being deported. I'm not putting it in the main points yet. I'm just giving you an example of how I would put in the facts. So the reason why I talk about this issue is that when the undocumented community is afraid to come forward, they don't report crimes, and thus crimes and criminals flourish in that environment. Before we politicize, and the ICE was created under the Bush administration and so forth. Before the politicization of this and the way we had it started in the 80s, the undocumented community could come forward to the police and not worry about repercussions or being turned in. And that was an important thing that happened, because criminals would target them if they didn't report it. And if you have that fear of being sent back to your country, you're not going to report the crimes. So, for example, if I wanted to divide this up into 2 subpoints, this issue into a main point, I would talk about, and I'm using the example here on the internet, ICE and what ICE does in targeting the undocumented community in Sanctuary City, and so forth, and trying to have cops turn in undocumented workers and migrants to ICE and things like that. So subpoint A could be a grouping of the fear coming forward and the repercussions of it, in that main point about the cause, right? So I'm talking about this issue, summarize it in the main point, and then in the subpoint, I didn't first talk about the setup, which is ICE and trying to get cops to turn in undocumented and causing an environment that they're afraid to come forward. And why is that important? Because then it goes into subpoint B, where you can then talk about and group examples of them not coming forward. And the best example of this is my hometown of Fresno, California, and the meth epidemic in Fresno. And news organizations, it's not up here, but I wanted to give you a simple Google search. Vice did a report about it. And because the undocumented communities are afraid to come forward, the criminals are targeting them at a greater rate. And once they get targeted and they have a steady supply of victims, they then say, well, how can we branch out? That's why you want undocumented not to feel threatened, and you want them to come forward, because if they don't, the criminals will go after them, and then from building from those victims, they will expand, and that is happening in Fresno, California. So you can see the setup. Let's go back to the main points here. If I was giving that speech, I know that was a lot of information and content, but if I would have summarized what I was talking about, main point 1, cause and effect speech. Main point 1, summary of your main point. Undocumented workers are afraid to come forward due to the threat of being deported. This is creating a place for criminals, a population for criminals to victimize and grow their criminal enterprise to everyday society. Subpoint A, the ICE and their tactics of using local law enforcement to nab undocumented migrants and undocumented workers, and pushing and pressuring them to do that forward, bringing that forward. Subpoint B, and unfortunately in places like Fresno, California, where the meth epidemic has exploded, a lot of the meth dealers have targeted the migrant community for drug abuse or just simple criminalization. And because that population has its limits, meaning that they can only get so much for it, they then have a base to start from, and it has exploded into other parts of the Fresno community. You see how that works? I had a main point. I introduced the concept, the idea of the main point, the cause of this issue. And then I divided it into 2 separate groups, the subpoints. The first group was talking about the setup, the problem of the situation, and then B, subpoint B, an example of real world of how that's affecting. You can actually do that a different way. You can make those 2 separate things. The reason why you do that is if it's too big to be put into one main point, that might be 2 main points, and then you subgroup from there. It's a lot of strategic planning, but it's actually not that hard, because your first speech is going to be real easy. Again, going back to my first example, in my past, I had this situation. Subpoint A, here's the situation it took place in. Subpoint B, examples of that situation. That's it. That's all a main point is. And you can repeat that process 3 different times. Main point 1, main point 2, main point 3. The only difference is that when we get into patterns and stuff, like you have to talk about your past for here, present here, and your future here. But it's the same setup. Explanation, subpoint A, example, subpoint B. And you can change you don't have to do the explanation examples. There's lots of different ways to do it. But when you have that kind of direction and your audience is familiar with it, if they're like, oh, I understand, there's an explanation examples. Oh, they're doing the same process again. It gets where your audience understands it a lot easier. You connect with the audience more, and it's a lot easier for you too when you divide it into groups. All right. If you have questions, save them for class and the discussions and so forth, but your participation is pretty easy. all you're going to do is, your outlines are not due yet, but you're going to just write up one of your main points in the discussion thread. I don't expect an essay, or I'm sorry, a paragraph. All I want is main point 1, a sentence to summarize your main point. And if you choose main point 1, it's your past. If you choose main point 2, it's your present. And main point 3 is your future. And then subpoint, a sentence talking about how you're going to group it, like I'm going to explain it. And then subpoint B, I'm going to give examples of this, stuff like that. Just simple. By the way, you don't have to write out everything. You're just three lines. Main point 1, and you can abbreviate that MP1. A sentence summarizing what the main point is. Subpoint A, SPA. What you're going to group there, what your focus will be on in that subpoint. And subpoint B, what you're going to group there. What's your focus on subpoint B. That's it. 3 sentences, put in that description, and that's your individual points for this week's discussion. If you need, a lot of students are using Canvas to contact me if they need explanations and so forth. That's perfectly fine. But what I expect is main point 1, a sentence explaining the main point, subpoint A, a sentence explaining the first focus, subpoint B, a sentence explaining the second point. 3 sentences, all right? You'll have a descriptive of it written up in the discussion thread as well, all right? All right, get to work, and see you in class this week. Oh, I gotta turn off the recording.